Well, if I were to mention in a commentary book what's only slightly mentioned in this book, but I find it quite significant for understanding the whole matter, over the past roughly 80 years, there have been two big waves of reforms in Europe. The first was after World War II. These reforms took place differently in the Soviet bloc countries, and differently, for instance, in France or West Germany. But fundamentally, these were quite similar reforms. The goal of these reforms was to transition from a war economy to a peaceful industrial state, to build a national state, to establish a national society, to build a, let's say, strong, highly educated society, and simultaneously one of those such assignments that was everywhere was to create an economy that would no longer generate crises like it did in the 20s. And this assignment was essentially the same for the English, Italians, Czechs, Poles, East Germans, West Germans, French, Hungarians. It doesn't matter. And of course, they dealt with this assignment differently, but in a way, seen through today's eyes, the reforms everywhere were pretty similar in the aspect that the state began to get heavily involved in the economy. Education was significantly strengthened, particularly technical education. Each country constructed its own industry. These features were similar, and it's quite interesting that these reforms were then studied by the Chinese in the 80s, while they were figuring out how to transform their own economy or their entire society. So they have traveled to study in Eastern and Western Europe, as it happened there after World War II. What's immensely surprising is that in the 90s, it interested nobody. This old reform didn't interest anyone. No one needed the experience. It was thought that if you simply executed it according to some textbook model, that it would work better. Well, we saw it. So it was one wave of reforms immediately after World War II. Then there was the second wave of reforms, which was in the 80s and 90s. Hey, we did today. We realized that we lost our national independence. We lost our industry. Many things that looked great at first turned out to be dysfunctional. But it's good to remember that we, the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, were by far not the only victims of these waves of changes. Great Britain essentially lost its industry, its factories, and fell into a crisis that it never recovered from. West Germany destroyed its successful model with those strange reforms. We could go from country to country, even the United States. After the reforms of the 80s and 90s, there was a significant deterioration of everything. But at that moment, it wasn't seen that way. Simply, the reform of the 80s and 90s went in the opposite direction, and I believe that when we take these tough reforms, the reforms of the 50s when the industrial state was built, and the reform of the 80s and 90s when the industry was being destroyed, and instead the market and finance and so on was supposed to decide everything. So we can see that the first reform was very successful, the second had tragic consequences, and that it's necessary, I write this in my book, to return to the reform after the Second World War, of course, after about 100 years, with different technologies and in different circumstances, to look at it and to do something similar.